Andrea Palladino is going to be the chief architect of the Venetian Republic from about 1570 until his death. Now, in order to study the ancient buildings firsthand, he will make several trips to Rome, and he will even work on illustrating translations of Vitruvius. Of course, we've come across that name before, a very famous Roman architect whose treatises are discovered, sort of air quote, discovered during the Italian Renaissance. Now, based on this, Palladino will go ahead and write his own architectural treatise known as the Four Books of Architecture. And in it, he lays out very basic ideas of how he believes architecture should function and its key role within larger social groups. So how does a home interact? How does a villa interact? That sort of thing. And gives us this idea of what's called Palladian architecture, which is characterized by classical forms, symmetry, and strict proportion. The exteriors are generally quite austere, and when you look at this example of Palladian architecture, you'll see that he's getting a lot of his ideas from the classical world, from the Greeks and the Romans. That is a classical Roman temple front right there. It doesn't have the pedimental sculpture that you would expect up here from the Greeks, but we have the use of metopes, we have the use of columns, we have the stair front, the whole 9 yards. Now, this is going to be important because this is one of those points where there's a lot of connections going on right through Venice. Because Palladino is going to bring back a lot of the Greek and Roman architectural ideas, but his architectural ideas are going to find their way to France, to the neoclassical. They're also going to find their way into the hands of Thomas Jefferson, who is going to visit France as the Minister of America in about up until about 1785. So right around the Revolutionary War. And he's going to bring those ideas back and create American neoclassical style, which is sometimes referred to as American Palladianism. Again, going back to our friend Palladino, who we're dealing with in the first place. I know lots of connections, lots of things, and we'll return to this later. But Jefferson basically brings this idea back. This is why we see, in part, why we see so many Greek and Roman characteristics when we look at government and federal buildings. His style, Palladino's style, is also going to find root in many of the palatial plantations that you see in the American South, specifically the Carolinas, Virginia, etc., where they tend to have those columned deep porch fronts. They tend to have those large symmetrical wings to them. They're going to be based on a lot of these ideas. Now, the piece we're actually looking at is back in Venice, because we have to get back to Palladino himself at San Giorgio Maggiore. Now, this is one of the most dramatically placed buildings in Venice, directly across the Grand Canal from the Piazza San Marco and the Palace of the Doges. Dissatisfied with earlier solutions for the problem of integrating a high central nave and lower aisles into a unified temple facade design, Palladino solved it by superimposing a tall, narrow classical porch on a low, broad one. This solution reflects the building's interior arrangement, and in that sense is strictly logical, but the intersection of the two facades is irrational and ambiguous, consistent with developments in contemporary Mannerist design. So what you're looking at is we have a structure where we have a tall temple in the middle, and that's taking up the tall central element of the nave that we see in so many churches from the Romanesque all the way to this point. But he's got a very wide aisle, so the church is also very wide across here. So what he does is he intersects it. We have the temple, and then we have a lower section of the temple, the lower section with square piers or pilasters, with these niches cut out, whereas the taller central section seems completely independent. But by putting the two together like this, it gets across the idea of the tall central nave inside and the very wide aisle. To tie the two together, he's got this slope on either side. He's kind of looking at Alberte's ideas that we saw his West Façade of Santa Maria Novella, except Alberte used scrollwork to do the same thing, to tie these ideas together. So one other thing that he's doing is he's trying to create this three-dimensional sort of sculptural element. His design creates the illusion of three-dimensional depth, an effect intensified by the strong projection of the central columns and the shadows that they cast. He's trying to cast shadows, something that we haven't really seen in Italian facades at this point. What he's doing is he's making it slowly. He's starting to make the facade sculptural, three-dimensional, interesting, something that you want to be drawn to. And this is something we haven't really seen much of in Italy to this point. Now, the interior is a very different story. It lacks the ambiguity of the facade and exhibits strong roots in high Renaissance architectural style. Light floods the interior and crisply defines the contours of the rich wall moldings with their archaeologically correct profiles, and this becomes an example of classical architectural theory. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying Palladino is taking a lot of Roman ideas and using them in architecture. What's Roman? Well, everything from the use of the column to the arches to the dome in the center. And in fact, we've seen a similar form before. Although it's not related to Palladino, I can't tell you that Palladino looked at this painting as an influence, but we can definitely see that the two are describing similar spaces. Long barrel vaults, which we see in both cases, large domes, which we see in both cases, the use of niches and arches and engaged columns, which we see in both elements. Now, Raphael is trying to reflect the Romans in the classical world, and Palladino is really kind of doing the same thing. The difference is Raphael is doing so in two dimensions without concern for weight and structure. Palladino is trying to turn this into real life, to take Greek and Roman ideas and describe them in a slightly new way in the Renaissance, developing what had happened in the classical world. And those developments are what get to Jefferson via neoclassicism in part and via Palladino's book, because Jefferson sees Palladino's book as his Bible of architecture. And that all comes to America via Thomas Jefferson and will eventually become the American neoclassical style that describes every federal building in Washington, D.C., from the Capitol to the White House to the Supreme Court.